It is truly my pleasure to be able to welcome all of you in joining today's webinar for an hour of discussion about how to thrive, almost thinking about the post-corona era after the crisis. And is part of the Turbulent Time webinar series. And what we're going to do is to give you a couple of examples, doing a couple of deep dive of companies and industry on how organization and leaders can prepare themselves so that they thrive during as well as after the crisis. Before we start, for those we never met yet, it's great to know you. And for those we have met already, great to reconnect through this medium as well. Today's webinar is really part of the series we come out from IMD, from the IMD Center for Future Readiness. And I'm so excited to have the team together with me as well to present some of you the early findings that we've got during the last 18 months or so. And so this is all very hot topic and new material we generated of thought leadership here at IMD. And so I am Professor of Management and Innovation at the institution, and I'm also the LEGO Chair Professor here at the school, and I'm the Director for the Center for Future Readiness. And what we are obsessed about are three questions I momentarily cover. But before we do that, I would just like to introduce the team so that they can say hello to you, because they will also be the one who address your question and point out additional resources and material as well. Over to you, Jalu.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jalu, a research fellow at IMD.
Hello, everybody. I'm Angelo, and I'm a research associate at IMD.
Hello, I'm Julia, and I'm a research intern at IMD.
Hi, I'm Lawrence. I'm a research assistant at IMD.
A lot of the work that we're going to present today is really from a team effort in understanding three fundamental questions. And these are the questions that we at IMD constantly ask ourselves. First is, what is the next seismic shift around us? Because as much as leaders, we kind of need to make sure we deliver today. Of course, we need to win big in the future. While delivering today's result, we need to prepare ourselves for the future. So one thing that effective executive must master is to able to seeing what next, so that you can leverage the seismic shift of the environment to your own favor. So one thing that we constantly ask ourselves is, what's changing in the landscape, in the environment, so that we can prepare ourselves better. Second is we want to understand how do company becoming future ready. What do they do? What is their strategy? More importantly, what is their allocation of resources? Because in the end, strategy is really the reflection of the pattern of resource allocation. So we want to understand how do these organizations becoming future ready. And then the third, obviously, is the human drama behind. Because in order to build something new, require dedicated focus into resources in a new area. Oftentimes it requires difficult conversation, tough trade-off, making choices. We also try to uncover here at IMD what are the managerial behavior and principle behind these company choices that appears to be rather tough oftentimes. So these are the questions we oftentimes ask ourselves. And of course, as you can imagine right now, during the pandemic, everything turned into sharp focus. Because if you think for a moment, the pandemic is almost like an accelerator or a time capsule. All of a sudden, it pushes us into the world of massive changes. As a result, we see a divergence. There are companies that are much more prepared for the future. Their performance are better than others. Take a very concrete example, work remote. We all work remote. There are companies that seems to be having a great time working remote. For instance, Spotify announced that they would go completely remote or remote first. Salesforce.com go for that as well. There are companies have long been complete remote even. And yet you have seen some other organization decided to turn back as soon as possible. JP Morgan Chase announced in New York City, starting in next month in April, they will bring back personnel across New York to the headquarters, not just retail branch staff members, but even back office personnel. Same thing for LVMH, for instance, they make that announcement too. So obviously some companies seems to be more capable and ready to prepare themselves, in this instance, work remote. As much as like Apple, right? They make iPhone, physical gadget. They run retail store. Tim Cook said, there are stuff that remote work actually is an advantage. I don't think we're going to go back completely anytime soon. Again, this is one of the many examples that we see this idea of the pandemic is almost like an accelerant. It pushes company and expose what company are much more prepared for the future and which companies seems to struggle quite a bit. So let me show you an example of a sector, and we can do a little bit of a deep dive underneath. And here is what the roadmap of today is going to look like. First is we're going to unpack a little bit what kind of company are thriving during the COVID crisis at this moment, so that we kind of understand why do some company deem to have a better growth prospect than others, or their fortune already restored, if not surpassed. Noted that we won't focus on tech giant. We know tech giants are winning. What I want to discuss is, what about the brick and mortar store, the regular one, who are doing better than others? And we want to unpack why. To give you a bit of preview, the reason why some companies are more successful than others is because they leap ahead of time. So this is the leap strategy. We're going to spend a little bit of time to unpack this concept. What is a leap strategy during crisis and why it is important going forward afterwards. Then the third, we're going to do an industry deep dive to apply the concept that we've got so far into a particular industry to understand what is going on. And then the last patch that we're going to cover is 4 principles for you to rethink about your company priority. Think about this as almost like an application exercise, if you will. I noticed that there are some hands went up. So if you have questions, please feel free to type into the Q&A box on the far right-hand corner. And then my research associate who have introduced themselves, they would jump right in and answer those questions as much as possible. And if you have other comment and thought as well, feel free to use the chat box as we go along the way. Okay. So before we go right into the framework, I just want to do a little bit of a brain teaser, and you're gonna answer a question in a poll momentarily that Jailu is gonna ring it up. But so this is essentially the share price performance of major retailers and consumer brand. Now, please bear in mind, none of these are tech giant. So when I said retailers, there is no Amazon. There is no Alibaba, none of those. These are traditional retailers and consumer brand, no Apple in there. Now, what you're seeing is during the pandemic, some of these retailers or consumer brand are doing far better than the others. So some companies are still around 99 or 94% at their pre-pandemic level, measured by share price performance on the stock market. Now, some companies, their share price performance are much better or emerge much stronger than in the past. So what I'm going to ask you is to guess who are the 3 winners. So inside the poll, you're going to see names of 6 companies. In the poll, I would invite you to check the first 3 companies. Who are the winners you think across these 6 firms? So these are the names of companies that are belonging to this chart. Guess who they are, those who win. So let's take some time and see what is going on. So for those who are not living in the United States, just for your background, Walgreens is the pharmacy store, one of the largest pharmacy chain in the United States. When GE fall off the cliff, they get kicked out from the Dow Jones Index about a year ago. And in replacing on that is exactly Walgreens becoming one of the Dow Index around 2019. So Nike still looking good. They were leading the pack. And so these are different companies, right? So you have Burberry, LVMH, Nike, Target, Walgreens, and Zara at the back. I'm just going to end the poll so that you can see what is the current result at the moment. So Nike is sitting on top, followed by Target and then Walgreens. So people, at least among us, we think Walgreens is doing well. So thank you so much, Jialu. So we're going to stop sharing the poll now. And if you think for a moment, this is close, but not exactly. Let me show you what it is. So it turns out Nike is really winning big for sure. Target, as the wisdom of the crowd, we also got it right. These are retailers really doing well. Now, it turns out Walgreens is not doing as well as it should. We think the COVID pandemic should give them a disproportional leverages because they're selling drugs left and right. But turns out it's not, because somehow that digital strategy is not as mature as compared to other companies like LVMH. LVMH turns out to be very, very well. During the pandemic, although stores are being closed, they were so good in online marketing. In China, they have live streaming as well. So that becomes a big deal for LVMH to pursue the international market share. And the way they engage consumer and customer is really world-class today. Now, compare and contrast, you have Burberry, Zara, and Walgreens. Now, what I want to point out here is first, none of these are tech giant. Nike is as traditional as you could imagine. But what separates the normal versus the outstander is the outstander, they have essentially leaped ahead of time, meaning they have mastered omni-channel, they have mastered digital platform, they have built direct to consumer relationship. So long before Apple has a Nike app that track your running performance, Nike almost 5, 6, 7 years ago, they have a little sensor where you could put those sensors on the back of your shoes. And as you run, they would track your performance. That is the type of direct to consumer experience that Nike have already built up. And so that direct to consumer experience become even more important during the pandemic, because that is how you entice user to purchase online and all of that. Now, what's interesting about this whole chart is, if you think about this digital strategy, Zara talk about that. Burberry also talk about that. Even Walgreens have the digital strategy. But what distinguishes those who are winning today is not just around experimentation, but it's their ability to scale things big. They need to really scale up their investment and not just experiment on the side, but really exploit. I would use the word, it's almost like focus, commitment, and exploit this field opportunity to its maximum potential. So what does it all mean? If you take a step back and imagine a retailers or any businesses, in order for them to be successful, they have certain way of doing things. Usually started off placing a lot of small bet. They start with exploring new stuff and then exploit, meaning scaling it big to become how they do businesses. So imagine you are automaker, traditional automaker like Ford, GM, VW, or BMW. Historically, you are mechanical engineering is your foundation knowledge. So this is what you're good at. This is your core competency. This is your core capability. What leap means is from time to time, you need to leap to the new knowledge or capabilities. So for retailer, like we saw in Nike, historically, they are very, very strong in doing mass marketing using standard channel, standard product. By the way, this is the core capability of any consumer brand, honestly, whether you're Nestle, Unilever, or Procter & Gamble. Today, they're all talking about they need to leap towards personalized shopping experience, omni-channel, customer offering. And all of these represent a new way or new core capabilities or core competencies. This is what we meant by leap. What you see in the previous example is organizations that have leaped ahead of time. Right now, their business result is much more resilient during the COVID-19 crisis. And going forward further after the Corona era, post-Corona era, likely they are much more well poised to capitalize growth opportunity. Same thing if you imagine Disney for a little bit, right? Historically, they're relying on mass marketing, standard channel, standard product, pushing big movie to cinema. Today, of course, is live streaming, personally offering omni-channel and customized offering. And Disney, fortunately, they have Disney Plus, which is a viable competitor against Netflix. And what you see today, right now, during the pandemic, is the share price that did not collapse despite their theme park and their cruise line are under pressure. That's a big deal because as a result, Disney is able to raise funds through corporate debt because the cost of borrowing remain low because the share price will remain high. That is what we meant by business resilience because they leaped ahead of time. During the pandemic, they have much more leeway and room for maneuvering as a result. But it's not just limited to consumer brand or entertainment sector like Disney, right? Automotive, we said about already before, is moving away from mechanical engineering to electric vehicle or self-driving car based on algorithm. What you're seeing here is again another leap in a complete different sector. As a result, now you see, of course, Tesla in terms of market capitalization is all-time high, is the most valuable automaker. Its valuation is the combination of Toyota, VW, BMW, GM, and Ford in combined. But that view is actually a little misleading because if you expand to all the EV makers in the world fourth and the fifth largest EV makers in terms of valuation is NIO and BYD, headquarters in Shenzhen as well as in Beijing. They are pure EV makers as well. What you're seeing here, because of the importance of LEAP, GM just announced by 2035, they would turn completely electrified. Volvo in Sweden also said by 2030, even more aggressively, they would turn completely electric, 100%, to leap from mechanical engineering based on internal combustion engine into complete new core competencies around electric motors and self-driving car algorithm. Now, again, in banking sector, historically, if you're a big bank, you essentially are managing retail branch, whether it's UBS or Credit Suisse or HSBC or JP Morgan Chase. You manage a physical branch network with really good human advisor or bankers to provide unparalleled customer services. This is what you're good at. What we're seeing today, of course, AI and mobile payment and mobile services is in full rage. And so it is very critical for organizations to understand what is lying ahead so that they can leap when time is on their side. Because under the pandemic or any global crisis, it's almost exposing companies who are the ones who are already future prepared versus those who just keep on talking but couldn't scale. The biggest challenge is not about placing small bet in the new area, but is to turn from exploration to exploitation. Is the ability to scale things big with commit focus. That tended to be the biggest challenge. And so for the rest of today's seminar, we're going to look at more. Why do some companies able to scale big versus others kind of struggle and couldn't do it quite well? So what we're going to do now is to do one more industry deep dive so that we could unpack a little bit more on why some companies are able to not just experiment on the side, but complete the entire leap cycle, meaning going through making small bet in new discipline, new capability, new areas, all the way to picking a few focus area and scale it big. So let's do a second exercise, a second brain teaser now. This is the global banking sector. So the financial sector. Again, you see there are big winners, and there are the ones that are sort of kind of okay, and then not just okay, in fact, they're doing pretty well, because if you're looking at the share price, it's 20% increase and 10%. It just the skew is kind of crazy. And then you have the ones that are still losing up to this point. So again, I'm going to ask Jailu to pull out the poll for us so that people can input their thought around who are the ones who are winning. So you can pick three, the top three, for instance, the 227%, 115, and 20%. Now, 20% doesn't seem a lot in comparison to 200, but 20% in a year in valuation increase is in fact very, very big. For those who don't know much about Square, Square is this payment company, a really hot company, in fact. They went off IPO a few years back, and they provide a small-time merchant for payment system. So you might have seen a little square thing that can attach to an iPhone, for instance, to process credit card payment system. This is what Square core product is. And today, of course, is all about mobile payment and mobile services as well. Now we have something over 80% people vote already. So Jialu, maybe we could move to take a look of the end result. Okay, so most of you think PayPal is winning very big, followed by essentially Visa and then MasterCard. So let me show you what happened. It turns out Square is really big. Now, Square as well as PayPal are really, really big. Now, the reason is the following, because these are digital native companies. If people getting stuck at home, you're going to do a lot of e-commerce or you're going to buy a lot of home delivery and you need payment system. So Square and PayPal are deemed by the financial market or investors in general. They have a really, really good future. Now, however, what you see there is Master and Visa card are doing relatively well too. MasterCard particularly is 20%. It's really remarkable. If you're thinking about an industry incumbent, remember a few years back, people kind of say like credit card is going to die, right? People kind of have this judgment around the credit plastic card is going to disappear one day because you have all this fintech disruptor coming along. You have Google Pay, Apple Wallet. They're going to disrupt the financial world left and right. And guess what? They are actually increasing in terms of growth, revenue, and etc. Not bad at all. Company that suffer the most turns out, for example, here is HSBC and RBS. Now, noted, these traditional banks, they do have a digital strategy. It wasn't like they were blind to change, but somehow what we're seeing is they fail to scale. So let me show you a couple of examples or our ranking back in 2019. So this is a natural experiment that we happen to run at IMD. So at IMD, we track corporate performance in terms of their readiness to the future. So I'm going to show you in detail how that ranking looks like. But essentially, we rank companies, how ready they are for the changing future. We take basically 11 categories of measurement from the core business health. The reason is the following. If the profitability as well as revenue growth of your core business already in decline, it's very hard for a company to invest in the future. So in order to invest in the future, you need to invest at the time that your core business is still strong. The second category of information we track and we measure to develop a composite score, the second element is R&D intensity. We track what about the IT expenditure, we track how much they invest in R&D, etc. But for this money to going into the right area, you need a diverse board. So we track diversity at the management board as well as employee, both gender, of course, nationality, but more importantly for the board level, industry background. Are these all bankers or they have external people from Silicon Valley, for instance? Then we're also looking at the financial market. Do investors have confidence around the future growth prospect of this firm? So that measured by, for instance, share price over revenue ratio. PE ratio, for instance. Then most importantly, we track the performance of the early innovation. Imagine you are Citigroup or Citibank. You launch a fintech innovation product in Singapore. If that turns out to be very successful, you probably would launch it in Hong Kong as a secondary market. If Hong Kong takes off, then you probably spread it over to Australia, then over to Europe and find its way to the US, for instance. So we measure how quickly these early innovation get spread around the world as reported by the public press. Out of 12 different categories, we compile it into a single score, and then we rank this company. What I'm about to show you is the 2019 ranking. That's before the current pandemic happened. And what you're about to see is back in 2019 versus today, there is an extreme strong correlation between whether they are future ready, track back in 2019, compare and contrast to today's share price performance during the pandemic. It turns out when you're future ready, when you have already leaped to the new knowledge discipline, when you have focused on mobile payment, mobile services powered by AI from day one, then what you see is during the crisis, your business turns out to be more resilient than others. Now, so you may ask, how did Visa and Master manage to do that? Because aren't they just incumbent? Turns out the logic at Visa and MasterCard is quite interesting because they kind of looking at if there are so many fintech disruption coming in, precisely like Square and PayPal is on the side and sieging us in terms of disrupting our core business. Visa and MasterCard essentially accept the fact if we try to invent everything by ourselves, we're going to be too late, too slow. If we cannot outcompete fintech disruptor, we better let them join us. So this is when they do a lot of strategic partnership and embrace a new business logic, frenemies. Sometimes you compete, sometimes you try to collaborate. So if you're looking at the left-hand corner, the top left-hand corner, that's PayPal. Historically, PayPal and Visa are enemy. They don't like each other. But then today, of course, Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, they are strong alliances. They work together with each other. In fact, for PayPal to move money across, oftentimes they are relying on Visa and MasterCard infrastructure. This is how you outcompete your potential threat. If you cannot beat them, you let them join you. Visa and MasterCard open up the infrastructure through API, application programming interface, so that other fintech disruptor can use them. Now, of course, it's not just a small player using them or the digital native. If you're thinking about Google Pay and Apple Wallet, they all use Visa and MasterCard infrastructure. On the left-hand bottom corner, you see Facebook icon. This is not Libra. This is not cryptocurrency initiative. This is Facebook credit before they even try cryptocurrency. And back then, they already need to use Visa and MasterCard. Again, on the right-hand corner, bottom corner, that's Coinbase, is one of the largest cryptocurrency exchange, and they have worked with Visa card to make sure people can, convert Bitcoin back to real money using the Visa card infrastructure. Again, what you see is by embracing the frenemies logic, Visa card and MasterCard was essentially able to make sure their infrastructure, their core capabilities still relevant for the future. Of course, it's tough to do. It's not easy. A lot of companies try it, but they couldn't embrace this radical notion of frenemies. Sometimes you compete, sometimes you are enemies. Now, one question you might have in mind already right now, if you haven't asked Lawrence or Angelo or Jailu or Yulia in the Q&A box is, well, Howard, I get that, but Visa and MasterCard, these are payment company in a way. Yeah, you say they're a credit card company, but in the end, they move money. They are not like HSBC or RBS or Wells Fargo. Those are banks, right? So is that the case when, if you're a payment company, then you happen to be lucky and so you're good now? The answer to that question is, turns out, no, it requires managerial choices. Because as much as you're thinking about Visa card and MasterCard are credit card companies and successful, American Express, they're also a credit card company. And yet American Express wasn't doing very well. So here is what happened. I'm going to show you a little bit about the story between Amex, American Express, versus Visa card and MasterCard, because it allowed us to zero into three players, the epic battle towards leap. All of them knows it's important to become digital first. All of them know the future banking industry is about mobile payment, mobile services. And yet American Express gets stuck, Visa and MasterCard move forward. And we're going to watch a short film to see how things actually unfold. But let me set you a little bit of context. But by the way, this is not about just financial sector, right? This is about how company can leap. This is about how company can build new capabilities and core competencies ahead of time. But we just zero in to use a quick example, between the three players, American Express, MasterCard, as well as Visa. By the way, before I show you that epic battle, this is our 2021 Leap Readiness Index. The one you just saw before is 2019. And so my research team have compiled the 2021 ranking across the financial sector. As you can see, the top number one is Ant Group, which IPO actually got stopped by the Chinese government a few months ago, if you remember. But because they are preparing for IPO, we take their prospectus and all the information, publicly available information, and do the ranking. And of course, they being digital first, born digital, supported by Alibaba, they are very, very much geared towards that future. Although for Ant Financial itself, their future remain uncertain, mostly because of this surprise regulatory regime imposed by Beijing. But the trend is inevitable. The trend for all players here is mobile payment, mobile service first, leveraging by AI on robo-advisory or some form of blockchain as well. But I would also want to point out two additional changes. What you're seeing is after the pandemic, the score between the top as well as the mainstream begins to get widened. In the past, in 2019, the gap is much more even, a slow drop. But by 2021, we see now is a huge gap in between. So it also goes to explain again how the pandemic becomes a great accelerant. It really distinguishes between winner and loser in a very strong form. So many of you, usually people would ask me, hey, Howard, can I get hold of the ranking? I want to understand the methodology behind this Leap Readiness ranking. And some of you already asked a lot of questions in the chat box already. Don't worry. So here is two articles that you could quickly check with the resources that my research team is also putting it into the chat box right now. You can click and take a look. On the left-hand side, that's exactly the ranking we just published on Visa and MasterCard. And you can see all the methodologies. We make it very transparent and open. If banking is too much finance for you, on the right-hand side, that's the consumer brand sector. We did a ranking as well for the consumer brand sector. So you could go look into this website and have you as additional resources for follow-up. And my research associate have already posted also in the chat box at this moment. But let's take a look on the epic game between Visa and MasterCard as well. So that would be a huge important key lesson learned on how and why some company get stuck versus other continue to accelerate in the right direction. So give you a little bit of backdrop first. So here are three companies. We're going to watch a short movie. And so we have MasterCard, Visa, and Amex. The size of the circle or the dot represent the market valuation of the company. So at that moment in time, back in 2010, Amex, American Express, was the largest one. It worth about 50 billion US dollar. Visa is around 45 and MasterCard is around 40. Amex is the largest player in the industry. Today, they are a distant third. So what happened? We're going to unpack how. On the y-axis, what you see is their focus around digital capability. This is where at IMD, my research team also have done large data, big data analysis. We basically take all the publicly available information written by Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and CNBC. 10 years of data we feed to an algo for it to see how do the company is being reported in the business news, how digitally obsessed they are. Now, of course, this type of textual analysis is only a rough gauge. But given this is big data, it gives you quite a good gauge about how digitally focused or obsessed these players are. On the x-axis, you have two concepts. One is explore, meaning you explore the field, you do experimentation, try things out. On the right-hand side is exploitation, meaning you focus, you exploit the current opportunity. What you see is these three players essentially start with similar position. Then much later, what we saw is MasterCard and Visa card maintain a healthy balance. They pretty much have exploitation activity as well as exploration activities. And as a consequence, they begin to understand more and more the importance of digital. Versus Amex, American Express, continue to focus on current near-term opportunity. They focus too much on exploitation activity. As a result, they didn't nearly focus on digital enough in the early phase. Then later, what you see is American Express wake up one day and try to explore as much as possible. But sadly, that's a little too late, too little. By then, Visa card and MasterCard is already moving to exploiting digital. This is when Visa and MasterCard forge all these digital alliances with different fintech startups. They have API lab to turn themselves away from the notion of a credit card company. But essentially today, they becomes a payment company. So what I'm going to do is to show you a little short film of this epic battle of three players. It's only less than 1 minute, but a very short film to see how things unfold over time. All right, so what you saw there is sort of an epic battle between all these guys of trying to fight in terms of becoming future ready. I saw there is one question that Angelo spot is important. Angelo, could you unmute yourself and tell me the question that I should really address in the plenary now?
Of course. So we have Alvin Hugh, who is posting the most upvoted question in our webinar, and he's asking, how can we predict what the future will be like?
Yeah, so thank you, Angelo. I mean, there are a couple of things that we could look at. And so at IMD, we always say, it's not about being the first mover, but in fact, you want to be the first one to get it right. So there are a couple of things that you could look at in order to see what is trending in the industry. Now, of course, when you're thinking about automakers or all the way to banking sector, etc., all of those are nothing of a secret. Because if you think for a moment on here on the right-hand side, all the consumer brands knows that personal experience and omnichannel and customized offering are key. This is no secret. It's always on the trade show and everyone talks about. In terms of automakers, electric vehicle companies have talked about that. In fact, BMW, once upon a time, they were leaders in electric vehicle as well. Remember BMW i3 and i5? But somehow these companies could not scale. I don't think it's the lack of insight, but they lack the capability or ability to complete the whole leap cycle. They fail to move from early exploration to exploitation. I'll come back to that notion. For banking, again, for the last 5, 6, 7 years, organizations have already long talked about the importance of mobile payment, mobile services. If you're bankers and if you're not aware of digital, it's almost impossible. So turns out you don't need a crystal ball to predict the future. If I were to ask you today, what is our working environment going to look like in the coming years? Of course, it won't be completely work remote, but work remote would be part of the equation. So a lot of the time, things like this turns out to be quite easy to spot. However, if you want to go more systematic approach, you should think about 3 factors. Number one is how many new entrants are coming into your own sector. The more new entrants coming in, the higher the urgency for you to leap next, because some smart new entrants will figure out a new business model. Second, you want to looking at the VC funding. The more VC venture capital funding coming in, the higher the chance some of these startups would be able to scale a business model to disrupt the ecosystem or the industry. So not that those startups would make a lot of money, no. But once they're able to scale, then it becomes a problem. The third is government regulation. Think about, are there changes in the government regulation would favor the new business model? Now, in financial sector, if you're living in Singapore or Hong Kong, we already see the central bank already allow non-banking entity to grant them banking license. These are changes of regulation that we must pay attention to. Or during the pandemic in the United States, telemedicine essentially get the government regulation. So I would suggest looking at startup scene, VC scene, government regulation, and last is your own profitability trajectory. If your core profit beginning to stagnate and not growing, and also in pressure for decline, meaning your audience, your customer have other choices. So that is a telltale sign that your offering may be under risk of getting commoditized. So all these consideration is for you to think about how the urgency for you to lead. So thank you, Angelo, for pointing this out. Now, some of you may ask me again, so that is interesting. Could we have a copy of the short film? And could you tell us more about what happened inside American Express, why they couldn't move the needle? And so here are two additional articles. You could use it as your resources to look up for. So there you would be able to looking at the short film again. On the right-hand side, we basically, my research team and I are really going through the analysis of what happened inside American Express. So what have we spoken so far? Because before we conclude today's session, I want to give you tangible tool that you can rethink and see and check how much your organization is prepared for the future. So I'll position 4 questions you could look at, or 4 areas that you can examine to looking at how ready of your organization is to become future ready. But what we've spoken so far is the importance of leap. What do we mean by leap? So first, we want to understand, number one, what is our historic core capabilities that allowed our organization to be so successful to become where we are? Again, for automaker historically is mechanical engineering based on internal combustion engine. If you're a manufacturer, probably some form of precision manufacturing capability that you think is the core competencies. What we're talking about is oftentimes at some point, organization must build up the new knowledge discipline, new core competence. And today, a lot of these based on AI derived capability. They look slightly different, but they're derived from AI. For automaker, it's self-driving car. For the consumer brand is the ability to directly engage your end consumer, not just brick and mortar store or distribution network, but go direct to end consumer level. For banking is mobile payment, mobile services. So think about what is the core future capabilities that your company must build. Then it leads to the third question. Do we bet enough? Have we made enough small experimentation in the early phase so that we could nail down something that have true potential? And then the last thing is, do our company have the ability to move and switch from early exploration to exploitation on focused area? What is interesting is organizations tend to get stuck with number 3, but unable to move to number 4. And in our research at IMD, we try to unpack what are these features of capable of moving from number 3 to number 4. So number 1, we saw organizations that can complete the whole leap cycle. They have to look beyond just peer group benchmarking. Because what you see is these organizations need to embrace a very different industry logic altogether. For Visa and MasterCard, they need to look themselves beyond just credit card company. They essentially see themselves as payment company in essence. So that's a big departure from the way they define themselves. Contrasting compared to American Express, they still see themselves as credit card company. They try to attract their loyal consumer and try to get them to spend as much money as possible. If one is only benchmarking to yourself, to your industry peer group, then it's awfully hard for you to have that determination to move to the new core competencies. The only way is to borrow the industry logic from others. The other insurers that we've been often talk about at IMD is Ping An, the world's second largest insurers in the world from China. And everything they do doesn't look like a traditional insurance company. They practically have borrowed the logic of Tencent and Alibaba and drive their business from there on. That demand executive to be externally curious. We cannot just be internally driven, but we need to maintain a curious outlook. So this is one tool that if curiosity is something that you like and want to explore more, again, in the website as well as on the link that my research associate would provide is additional material for you to ask yourself or your team how curious we are as individuals. Are we having our radar screen spread enough to understand and able to see what's next? So I would define number one, look beyond your peer group benchmarking as the precondition to leap. Then there's the second one. Allocate resources to early experimentation. You saw earlier in American Express in this early phase, the reason they were focusing too much on exploitation activity on the current businesses or on the current knowledge is because they don't spend enough time and money and resources in experimentation. In order for you to leap or reinvent yourself, you have to try things out, at least in the beginning. Some of these will work out, some of these may not work out. So this is why it's so critical for organization to allow failure in its early phase. And what is failure looks like if your organization is really embrace experimentation? Lots of failures. So in this second article, we basically document how many failures Amazon have suffered over the years. It's a laundry list. Jeff Bezos is smart, but he also commit a lot of mistakes. In fact, he said our company, as we grow bigger and bigger, the cost of failure should also rise correspondingly. So because they can afford bigger amount of failure. But this is how you are able to, guided by evidence, to make choices. Then the third stage is committed choices, moving away merely from early experimentation to something much more tangible, to exploit new capability. So which means that you kind of need to also changing KPI as well, key performance indicator. This is interesting because a lot of the company, although they have a grand vision, they know where things need to go. When it comes down to performance measurement, they get trapped with historic metrics. And this is where we see organizations that are able to leap, they change KPI as well. Current CEO from Microsoft, Satya, he said there are lagging indicators. Those are financial performance. But there are also leading indicators, and he defined a number of them, such as customer engagement, customer love is what he said. So we've got to figure out, as you monitor the early progress of your experimentation, none of these would give you financial return yet. A new business would never be profitable as your core. How do you define early indicator to so that it can show us early traction that you gain, whether it's customer engagement, or translated to all of these measurements so that you can gauge the health, whether you're doing enough in the early phase or not. But as we said earlier, at some point, you sort of need to exploit the new capabilities. Enough is enough. It's sort of like the whole story that there are organizations keep their option open for too long and keep on exploring until time is up. So Polaroid is a great example. They have experimented a lot on digital, in fact. They have all this digital camera at one point. In fact, the digital camera at one point in the United States was the best-selling digital camera. But they fail because they keep on exploring without the commitment, moving things onto a concrete allocation of resources. That becomes the failure. And on this element, on this line, there is also an additional resources for those who want to explore further why and when organization needs to foreclose option based on evidence so that you can focus on new area. Moving from exploration to exploitation, this is a piece that you would find potentially quite useful. But to summarize what we've spoken so far, is essentially the top team would require a shared viewpoint about the future. Because we could delegate, a top team or any leadership team can delegate experimentation to general manager, and they would do a good job. And we need to encourage that environment. But at some point, it's also the burden or responsibility for the top team to recognize after the fact that this is an area gaining traction. We had enough evidence to suggest this is important, and we have built up enough capability. Now it's time to scale. That is exactly what Microsoft is able to have its turnaround. Remember, before CEO Satya come along, it was Steve Ballmer's, and Microsoft was really in bad shape. They missed mobile payment. They missed mobile phone. They also missed the cloud. They missed tablet, everything they missed. Under Satya, it's no longer just all this experimentation, but really focus scaling up dedicated effort into 365 as a subscription model on our Microsoft Office, but also alongside with cloud computing and augmented reality. So it's really, we are now moving into the stage of how we move from just experimentation to scaling things big. So let me close out today's webinar, and I'm happy to take one or two questions guided by my research associate on the top voted question. But here are three ways that we could stay in touch. On the left-hand side, there's our center website. And if you would like to engage some more of the IMD program, there are two programs that I personally direct. And check it out for any, some of these are online programs, some of these are in-person programs scheduled later of this year. And feel free to connect me on LinkedIn and or engage to my blog. And so we could continue the conversation as we go along. But I'm gonna pause here and let Jialu or Angelo to tell me what are some of the burning question, or if there's any remaining question remain unanswered at this stage.
So we have, as the most upvoted question at the moment from Kareem, one on Lego. So he's saying that Lego is particularly good in incorporating the leap mindset. And he's asking how they manage to keep those principles in mind and continue to innovate in the digital space.
This is a very, very good question. So I happen to have a close collaboration with Lego Group, and they really maintain a curious mindset. My goodness, it's not just a product that they embrace, but it's also playfulness is part of their corporate culture. They want people to be able to stay curious and externally focused. So what happened? Of course, manager, executives, and top leadership, they are aware what's going on around them. The gaming industry, how the tastes among kids are changing, and they encourage managers to really experiment on their own ground, so that based on real evidence, then they would pick focus area to scale. And if you have keep track with Lego, a few weeks before on the Financial Times, it has been reported publicly, they are now hiring a huge amount of digital talent, software programmer, whatnot, because they see themselves going forward would be digital first. So they are in fact going exactly the leap cycle. Historically, they have their own knowledge base, like a consumer brand would, but now they're seeing, wow, digital is really big. We need to master that new skill and reinterpret in our own sector. And this is what they do. So it is exciting to see how a legendary brand based on physical product, brick and mortar, can in fact leap ahead of time as well. And during the pandemic, by the way, some of you may have keep track as well, Lego revenue and sales performance has been going through the roof. Thank you, Kareem. All right. So thank you so much for everyone to dial in today. I think this is a really wonderful discussion that we had. And so please stay in touch. There are many of the other leading through turbulent time seminar that at IMD we have scheduled. So please stay in touch on the calendar as you go along, and feel free to reach out to me, my team. There are tons and tons of research finding. We're generating new insight every week. We put it on the blog to engage our readers to have an informed dialogue going forward. And of course, it's also my hope the current pandemic is soon going to be over. We're seeing light through the tunnel right now. And one day I would wish to see many of you, if not just some of you, over at IMD in Lausanne to have a coffee, to have a meal, to engage you and continue with our dialogue. So thank you so much for spending your time with us. Particularly those in Asia, it's late, it's almost 7 o'clock now. For those in Europe, have a great afternoon setting off. And for those in US or Americas in general, have a very, very good morning. Thank you so much for waking up so early. Some of you really wake up so early just to have this wonderful conversation. My goodness, thank you for your enthusiasm. It's wonderful to have more than 300 people locking in. My God, it's bigger than our big auditorium at IMD. But with that, I wish you a wonderful day. Stay safe and see you very soon. Goodbye now.